When I ask you to think about a classic animated film, chances are you're going to think about something like this, or maybe this. Now, think about one of your favorite modern animated films. You're probably thinking about something like this, or this. While all the films I just showed you shots from are animated, the first two were created using hand drawn animation, and the second two were created using computers. Over the last 2.5 decades or so, we have seen a major transition in the animated film space. The rise of computers and other electronics in the 90s didn't just lead to new cell phones and Wi-Fi, it also led to the birth of computer animation. But in order to understand this transition, we really should first go back to 1989 and the start of the Disney Renaissance. After a string of successful films in the 50s and 60s, Disney's animation department had sort of hit a bit of a lull in the 70s and 80s with a series of commercial and critical disappointments after the death of Walt Disney. By the end of the decade, Disney was in bad shape, and it looked like their time at the top of the world of animation was over. But it wasn't. In fact, Disney was about to start an unprecedented period of both critical and commercial success, which would later come to be known as the Disney Renaissance. Between the years of 1989 and 1999, Disney released 9 of their most well-known films, and The Rescuers Down Under, which really shouldn't count. What started with The Little Mermaid becoming a huge critical and commercial success led into the success of films like Beauty and the Beast, which also became the first animated film to be nominated for Best Picture, Aladdin, and ultimately Disney's crown jewel, The Lion King, which not only became the highest grossing animated film of all time, but was also the most successful film of 1994. Notably, in this time, Disney had started experimenting with using computer animation in their films to animate more complicated elements. They had also started exclusively using computers to color and ink their films. With the release of The Lion King, Disney looked like they could do no wrong. But with the departure of Jeffrey Katzenberg, the man who had been running Disney's animation department, as well as some other high-profile turnovers, Disney was headed for some choppy waters. It's at this point we should probably introduce the other major player in 90s animation, the lamp that would in many ways fundamentally change the future of the art. Of course, I'm talking about this guy. Pixar was a company that was started in the 80s by John Lasseter and was dedicated to creating computer animation. In many ways, the rise of this art form was inevitable. What had started with primitive computer graphics in movies like Star Wars, no joke, this is the only CGI in that movie, had slowly progressed in the 2 decades that followed. Films like Tron, with its almost entirely computer-generated backgrounds, Young Sherlock Holmes, which contained the first ever fully CGI character in The Stained Glass Knight, and Terminator 2, with its heavy use of CGI for its villain, had all pushed the medium forward to such an extent that a movie made entirely with CGI was almost inevitable. It's important to recognize that that really is what computer animated films are. They're just films that are entirely made using CGI. And these previous 2 decades of development, as well as the software Pixar had been creating, led to their debut film Toy Story in 1995 being not only a revolutionary film, but a major success. Pixar hadn't relied just on having new technology, though. They knew that if they wanted their film to be successful, they had to combine it with a compelling story. That's why all these years later, when Toy Story looks, and we can admit it, very outdated, people still come back and love it. Notably, though, Toy Story wasn't the only high-profile animated film to be released in '95. Disney also had a movie that they were counting on being a huge success. Pocahontas seemed like it should be a surefire bet. It had the love story that had worked so well for Disney in both Aladdin and Beauty and the Beast, and a song that people already knew and loved in Colors of the Wind, which had been used heavily in the marketing. But it ended up being a major disappointment. Making just about a third of the money Lion King had made, Disney was not happy with its performance. Maybe it was the slightly less stellar critical reviews. Maybe people were just tired of Disney musicals. But maybe it was the audiences were looking for something new and different, with the release of Toy Story just around the corner. Toy Story ended up making $405 million, a far cry from the money Lion King had earned, but still enough to beat out Pocahontas' $346 million gross. Now notably, Pixar was not an established studio. This was their first film, and Pocahontas was being released by Disney. And this pattern of diminishing returns for Disney while Pixar continued to achieve greater and greater success wasn't over. Disney's next 2 films, The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Hercules, were both unable to recapture the success of those early Renaissance films. And in 1998, Pixar's next film, A Bug's Life, would once again become more successful than Disney's offering that year, which was Mulan. In 1999, Disney would release Tarzan, which would be their first very successful film since The Lion King. And, wouldn't you know it, critics praised it for its blend of computer and hand-drawn animation. Looking at Disney and Pixar in the 90s is really representative of the decade as a whole, because you have new technologies which had been being developed for a while coming in and replacing things which had been established for a long time. In 1985, barely anyone had internet, but by the year 2000, Wi-Fi was in 50% of American households. VHSs were replaced by CDs as the way to watch movies, tapes were replaced by CDs for music, and mobile phones became a common product to own. After the 90s, people were looking for the latest and greatest technology in everything they did. And maybe that's why the string of hand-drawn animated films that Disney released in the early 2000s were never able to achieve the same success as Pixar's movies. The public viewed hand-drawn animation as something that belonged on TV, and not in theaters, which is really a shame because it's a unique and beautiful art form which is kind of being lost. The point of this video is not to say that hand-drawn animation is dead or gone, but we are at a point where no studio is releasing hand-drawn animated films in theaters because they know they just won't be successful. And that's sad, but it's also sort of just how these things go. New technologies come in and set new standards for what people expect, and the old way of doing things is pushed out not because it was bad, but because people believe it can be done better. The good news is that, thanks to technology, we will always be able to go look back at our favorite hand-drawn animated films, as computer animated movies pave the way for the future.
So long.